All I wanted was to keep my family together and build the career I'd worked 10 years for. But when my husband's mistress got promoted to vice president, the first thing she did was demote me to her personal secretary. They thought I'd quietly accept my new role as the company coffee girl, while she flaunted their affair in front of the entire office. What they didn't know was that I had been documenting everything, and I was about to turn their little power play into the biggest mistake of their professional lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Thompson, and until 3 months ago I thought I had it all figured out. I was a senior marketing manager at Sterling Marketing Solutions here in Austin, Texas, pulling in a solid salary that helped support our family. My husband Michael worked in sales at the same company, which is how we met 12 years ago at the annual Christmas party. We had 2 beautiful kids, Emily, who just turned 16, and Ryan, who's 14, and a comfortable life in our 4-bedroom house in Cedar Park. Every morning I'd wake up at 5:30 to make breakfast for the family, pack lunches for the kids, and still manage to look professional for my 7:30 arrival at the downtown office. I took pride in my work, in the campaigns I developed, in the client relationships I'd built over a decade of dedication. I genuinely believed that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded, that the company valued what I brought to the table. The Sterling Marketing Building sits on the 15th floor of a sleek glass tower on Congress Avenue, and every morning when I stepped out of the elevator, I felt like I belonged there. I had my own corner office with a view of Lady Bird Lake, a team of 3 junior marketers who looked up to me, and a track record of successful campaigns that had helped grow the company's revenue by 30% over the past 5 years. David Harrison, our vice president of marketing, had been talking about retirement for months. He was 58, had been with the company since the beginning, and everyone knew he was looking forward to spending more time with his grandchildren. The natural assumption, at least in my mind, was that I'd be considered for his position. I had the experience, the results, and the institutional knowledge that made sense for a promotion. Michael and I would talk about it over dinner sometimes, how the VP position would mean better hours, better pay, and more stability for our family. Emily was already talking about college, and Ryan was getting serious about baseball, which meant potential travel expenses for tournaments. The promotion would have solved a lot of our financial planning concerns. What I didn't know was that while I was focused on quarterly reports and campaign metrics, Michael was busy getting to know Jessica Martinez, the new marketing director who'd been hired 6 months earlier from a competing firm in Dallas. Jessica was 35, ambitious, and had a way of commanding attention when she walked into a room. She wore designer suits that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months, and she had this confident laugh that seemed to echo through the office hallway. I should have noticed the signs earlier. Michael started working later, claiming he needed to collaborate on projects with the new team members. He'd come home talking about Jessica's innovative ideas and fresh perspective on digital marketing trends. When I suggested we grab lunch together like we used to, he'd say he was too busy with important meetings. When I asked about his day, he'd give vague responses about strategy sessions and planning committees. The first real warning came during our monthly department meeting in February. David announced that the company was restructuring the marketing division, bringing in new leadership to take the department in a more modern direction. He introduced Jessica as someone who would be taking on expanded responsibilities, someone who understood the digital landscape in ways that would benefit all of us. I remember sitting in that conference room, watching Jessica present her vision for the future of our department. She spoke confidently about social media integration, influencer partnerships, and data-driven personalization strategies. Her presentation was polished, professional, and impressive. I found myself taking notes, genuinely interested in learning from her expertise. After the meeting, I approached her in the hallway. I told her I thought her ideas were exciting and that I'd love to collaborate on implementing some of her strategies with my existing client base. She smiled politely and said she looked forward to working together, but there was something distant in her tone, something that made me feel like I was being evaluated rather than welcomed as a colleague. That evening, I mentioned the meeting to Michael over dinner. I told him how impressed I was with Jessica's presentation and how I thought her leadership could really help grow our department. He nodded along, but I noticed he seemed unusually interested in the details of what she'd said. asking follow-up questions about her background and experience that seemed oddly specific for someone who wasn't directly involved in marketing. March brought more change. Jessica started scheduling one-on-one meetings with each team member, which she called strategic alignment sessions. When my turn came, she sat across from me in the small conference room, her laptop open and her expression serious. She asked about my current projects, my career goals, and my thoughts on the direction of the department. I was honest with her. I told her about my 10 years with the company, my successful campaigns, and my hope that I might be considered for David's position when he retired. I explained how I'd been gradually taking on more leadership responsibilities, and how several of our biggest clients specifically requested to work with me on their accounts. Jessica listened politely, occasionally jotting down notes on her laptop. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She told me she appreciated my dedication and that my experience was certainly valuable to the team. Then she said something that should have been a red flag, but at the time I interpreted as encouragement. She said the company was looking for fresh energy in leadership positions, people who could think outside traditional frameworks and challenge conventional approaches to marketing. She mentioned that my background was solid, but the industry was evolving rapidly and required leaders who could adapt to new paradigms. The way she said it made it sound like a gentle suggestion that I needed to modernize my thinking, which I took as constructive feedback. Looking back, I realized she was already positioning me as outdated, as someone whose experience was valuable but whose leadership potential was limited. She was laying the groundwork for what would come later, establishing a narrative that would make my eventual demotion seem reasonable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. April brought the announcement that changed everything. David called an all-hands department meeting on a Thursday afternoon. He stood at the front of the conference room with Bob Sterling, our CEO, and announced his official retirement effective at the end of the month. Then Bob stepped forward and introduced Jessica Martinez as our new vice president of marketing. I felt my stomach drop. Jessica stood up, smoothed her navy blue blazer, and walked to the front of the room with the confidence of someone who had been expecting this moment. She thanked David for his years of service and spoke about her vision for taking the department to new heights. She talked about innovation, disruption, and the need for bold leadership in an evolving marketplace. The applause around the room felt hollow to me. I clapped along with everyone else, but inside I was reeling. I had assumed I was at least in consideration for the position. I had assumed that my decade of loyalty and proven results would count for something. I had assumed that I mattered to this company in a way that would be recognized and rewarded. After the meeting, several colleagues approached me with sympathetic looks. Mark Stevens, another marketing manager who'd been with the company for 8 years, shook his head and muttered about how they should have promoted from within. Patricia from HR gave me a knowing look that suggested she understood my disappointment, but couldn't say anything official about the decision-making process. That night I drove home in a daze. I sat in my car in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside, trying to process what had happened and how I was going to explain it to Michael and the kids. When I finally walked through the front door, Emily was at the kitchen table working on homework and Ryan was sprawled on the couch playing video games. Michael was in the living room watching the news, and when I told him about Jessica's promotion, his reaction was strange. Instead of the outrage or disappointment I expected him to share with me, he seemed almost unsurprised. He nodded thoughtfully and said something about how the company probably wanted to bring in outside perspective, how sometimes fresh blood was necessary for growth. I stared at him, confused by his casual acceptance of what felt like a betrayal of everything I'd worked for. When I pointed out that I'd been passed over despite my qualifications and track record, he shrugged and said that maybe this was an opportunity for me to learn from someone with different expertise. He suggested that working under Jessica might actually be good for my career development. The way he said it, with such easy dismissal of my disappointment, made me feel small and foolish for having expected more. I went to bed that night questioning whether I'd been naive to think I deserved the promotion, wondering if maybe I really wasn't ready for that level of responsibility. The next morning, Jessica called me into her office for what she described as a transition meeting. Her office was the same one that had been David's, but she'd already made changes. The family photos and golf trophies were gone, replaced by modern art prints and a few strategic books about digital transformation and leadership innovation. She gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk, the same chair where I'd had countless productive meetings with David over the years. But the dynamic felt completely different now. Instead of the collaborative partnership I'd enjoyed with David, this felt more like a performance review with an uncertain outcome. Jessica opened a folder and pulled out what looked like an organizational chart. She explained that she was restructuring the department to create more efficiency and clearer lines of accountability. She spoke in corporate buzzwords about optimizing workflows and maximizing human resources, but the bottom line became clear when she slid the chart across the desk for me to see. My name was no longer in the box labeled Senior Marketing Manager. Instead, I was listed under a new position titled Executive Assistant to VP of Marketing. The job description included managing Jessica's calendar, coordinating meetings, handling correspondence, and providing administrative support for department initiatives. I stared at the chart, reading my new title over and over again, certain there had been some kind of mistake. Executive Assistant was barely a step above Secretary, a role that would eliminate every aspect of my job that I found meaningful and challenging. No more client relationships, no more campaign development, no more strategic planning, or creative problem solving. When I looked up at Jessica, she was watching me with an expression that seemed almost curious, as if she was studying my reaction for her own entertainment. She explained that this restructuring would allow her to focus on high-level strategy, while ensuring that operational details received proper attention. She said my experience and institutional knowledge made me the perfect person to help her navigate the company culture and maintain continuity during the transition. I asked about my current projects, the campaigns I was managing, the client relationships I'd spent years building. Jessica waved her hand dismissively and said, those responsibilities would be redistributed among other team members who could benefit from the experience. She said it was important for the department to develop depth and not rely too heavily on any one person for critical function. The meeting lasted 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Jessica presented my demotion as if it were a logical business decision, as if my new role was actually a promotion in terms of responsibility and access to executive-level operation. She spoke about the importance of supporting leadership and how administrative excellence was crucial to departmental success. When she finished explaining my new position, she asked if I had any questions. I sat there, stunned into silence, trying to process what had just happened to my career. Finally, I managed to ask about the salary implications of this change. Jessica's smile became even more patronizing as she explained that my compensation would be adjusted to reflect my new responsibilities, which translated to a $20,000 pay cut. $20,000. The amount hit me like a physical blow. That money represented Emily's college fund contributions, Ryan's baseball expenses, and our family's financial security. It meant we'd have to reconsider our vacation plans, maybe refinance the house, definitely cut back on the small luxuries that made our middle-class life comfortable. I asked if I could think about the position change, maybe just. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Discuss it with my family before making a decision. Jessica's expression hardened slightly and she reminded me that this wasn't really a negotiation. She said the restructuring was final and that my choice was to accept the new role or explore opportunities elsewhere. She added that in today's job market, stability was valuable and that leaving the company would mean starting over somewhere else without the benefit of my established relationships and reputation. The threat was clear even though it was wrapped in professional language. Accept the demotion and the pay cut, or find yourself unemployed in a competitive market where my decade of experience at Sterling Marketing might not translate easily to another company. That afternoon, I sat in my car in the parking lot of Roasted Dreams, the coffee shop on South Lamar where I'd often met clients for informal strategy sessions. I called my best friend Amy, who worked in marketing for a tech company downtown. When I told her what had happened, the silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Amy spoke and her voice was tight with anger. She said what Jessica had done sounded illegal, that demoting someone without cause could be considered constructive dismissal. She suggested I contact an employment lawyer, maybe file a complaint with HR, definitely start documenting everything in case I needed to build a case later. But even as Amy spoke, I felt the weight of practical reality settling over me. Legal battles cost money and time, both of which I was about to have much less of. HR complaints could make my work environment even more hostile, and Patricia Williams had already made it clear through her expressions that she knew what was happening but couldn't or wouldn't intervene. I drove home that evening with a sense of dread that felt like a stone in my chest. I had to tell Michael and the kids that everything we'd planned for was about to change, that the financial stability we'd built over years of careful budgeting was suddenly in jeopardy because of one woman's power play. When I pulled into our driveway, I noticed Michael's car was already there, which was unusual since he'd been working late almost every night for weeks. I found him in the kitchen, looking unusually cheerful as he helped Emily with her math homework. The domestic scene would have been heartwarming under different circumstances, but something about his mood felt off given what I'd just experienced. I waited until after dinner when the kids had gone upstairs to finish homework, before telling Michael about my meeting with Jessica. I explained the demotion, the pay cut, and the impossible choice I'd been given. I expected him to be outraged on my behalf, to share my anger and help me figure out how we were going to manage the financial impact. Instead, Michael listened with what seemed like patience, nodding occasionally and asking clarifying questions that felt oddly detached. When I finished explaining the situation, he was quiet for a long moment before suggesting that maybe this change wasn't as bad as it seemed. He pointed out that an executive assistant role would probably have more regular hours, less stress, and more predictable responsibilities. He said the pay cut was unfortunate, but that we could adjust our budget and maybe this was an opportunity for me to have better work-life balance. He even suggested that being closer to executive decision-making might give me insights that could benefit my career in the long run. I stared at my husband, the man who was supposed to be my partner and advocate, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air condition. His reaction was so measured, so rational, so completely lacking in the indignation I felt, that it seemed like he was reading from a script. It was as if he'd already considered this scenario and prepared his response. That night, as I lay in bed listening to Michael's steady breathing beside me, I replayed every conversation we'd had about Jessica over the past few months. I thought about his unusual interest in her background, his late nights at the office, and his surprisingly calm reaction to news that should have devastated our family's financial plan. A terrible suspicion began forming in my mind, one that I tried to push away, but that kept returning with increasing insistence. I started wondering if Michael's support for Jessica's perspective wasn't just professional admiration. I started questioning whether his late nights were really about work projects, or something else entirely. But even as these doubts crept in, I told myself I was being paranoid. Michael and I had been married for 12 years. We had built a life together, raised 2 children together, and supported each other through career challenges and family crises. Surely I was just projecting my workplace frustration onto my marriage, looking for someone to blame for what felt like a betrayal by the company I'd devoted a decade of my life to. The next morning, I walked into the Sterling Marketing Building with my letter of acceptance for the executive assistant position tucked in my purse. I had spent the night running numbers, exploring options, and facing the reality that I couldn't afford to lose my job entirely. Emily's college applications were due next year, Ryan's baseball team fees were coming up, and our mortgage payment didn't care about my wounded pride. I rode the elevator to the 15th floor for what felt like the last time, as Senior Marketing Manager Rebecca Thompson. Tomorrow I would be Executive Assistant Thompson, fetching coffee and scheduling meetings for the woman who had dismantled my career with the efficiency of someone swatting a fly. What I didn't know was that this demotion, as humiliating and financially devastating as it felt, was actually going to become the best thing that ever happened to me. Because being Jessica's assistant meant I was about to get a front row seat to her methods, her priorities, and most importantly, her relationship with my husband. And what I discovered in that front row seat would give me the ammunition I needed to turn their little power play into the biggest mistake of their professional and personal lives. My first day as Jessica's executive assistant began at 6 in the morning with a text message that made my stomach turn. Rebecca, I need you in the office by 7 to prepare for my 8 a.m. with the Hartwell Industries team. Coffee should be ready, conference room set up, and materials print. Thanks. I stared at my phone in the dim light of my bedroom, Michael still sleeping peacefully beside me, the casual tone of her message, as if she were asking a favor rather than giving orders to someone she'd just demoted, made my jaw clench. 7 a.m. meant leaving the house before the kids even woke up, abandoning the morning routine I'd maintained for years of making breakfast and ensuring Emily and Ryan started their day properly. When I gently shook Michael awake to explain the situation, he mumbled something about it being temporary and rolled over. No offer to help with the kids' morning routine, no acknowledgement that Jessica's demands were already disrupting our family life, just acceptance that my needs had suddenly become secondary to hers. I arrived at the office building as the sun was barely peeking over the Austin skyline, the downtown streets still quiet except for a few early commuters and joggers along Lady Bird Lane. The security guard looked surprised to see me so early, checking his watch as he buzzed me through to the elevators. I'd always taken pride in being punctual, but this felt different. This felt like servitude. Jessica's office, formerly David's sanctuary where I'd had so many productive strategy sessions, had been completely transformed. Gone were the warm oak furnishings and family photos that had made the space feel welcoming. In their place were sleek modern pieces, stark white surfaces and abstract art that looked expensive but cold. Even the lighting had been changed to something harsher, more clinical. She'd left a detailed list on what used to be David's desk, now clearly her domain. The conference room needed to be arranged with specific seating charts, printed materials had to be organized in precise folders, and she wanted her coffee prepared exactly as specified in the attached note. Ethiopian single origin, medium roast, with exactly 1 teaspoon of raw honey and a splash of oat milk. The specificity felt deliberate, as if she was testing my willingness to follow instructions down to the smallest detail. As I worked through her list, setting up the conference room and arranging materials, I couldn't help but think about how different this felt from my previous role. Just last week I would have been the one preparing for this meeting, reviewing client data and developing presentation strategy. Now I was arranging chairs and making sure the water glasses were positioned correctly. The Hartwell Industries team arrived precisely at 8, and I watched from behind the conference room's glass walls as Jessica conducted the meeting with impressive confidence. She spoke about digital transformation and customer engagement metrics, with the fluency of someone who genuinely understood the material. I had to admit, despite my personal feelings about her, that she was effective in the role. What bothered me more was how natural she looked in the position I'd expected to inherit. She commanded the room with an ease that made me question whether I would have been as compelling in that seat. The doubt was uncomfortable, making me wonder if my decade of experience really did translate to leadership potential or if I'd been overestimating my readiness for advancement. After the meeting, Jessica called me into her office with a casual wave that felt more like summoning a server than requesting a colleague's attention. She handed me a stack of handwritten notes from the meeting, and asked me to type them up into a proper summary report. The notes were detailed and insightful, but they were also my handwriting assignment, a task that any entry-level administrative assistant could handle. As I sat at my new desk, positioned just outside Jessica's office where I could see her through the glass partition, I felt the weight of my career regression. My old office, with its view of the lake and walls covered with awards and client appreciation letters, had been reassigned to Marcus Webb, a talented but relatively junior marketing coordinator who looked uncomfortable inheriting space that clearly exceeded his experience level. The phone calls started around 10 a.m., vendors wanting to schedule meetings with Jessica, clients requesting updates on campaigns that were no longer my responsibility, and internal colleagues who seemed confused about my new role. Each conversation required me to explain that I was no longer handling strategic marketing, but could schedule appointments or direct inquiries to the appropriate team members. The most difficult call came from Sarah Mitchell, the CEO of Riverside Restaurant Group, who'd been my client for 3 years. She'd specifically requested me for their upcoming rebranding campaign, and when I explained that I was no longer in a position to manage her account, the silence on the line stretched uncomfortably long. "Rebecca, I don't understand," Sarah finally said, her voice sharp with confusion. "You've handled every major campaign for us since we started working with Sterling. You know our brand better than anyone. Why would they move you to a different role right when we're planning our biggest project?" I fumbled through an explanation about departmental restructuring and new leadership priorities, but Sarah cut me off.
"This is ridiculous. I'm calling Bob Sterling directly. We pay too much money to this company to have our account manager arbitrarily reassigned without consultation." After Sarah hung up, I sat staring at my phone, feeling a mix of gratitude for her support and anxiety about the attention her complaint might draw. The last thing I needed was for Jessica to perceive me as undermining her decisions, or encouraging client dissatisfaction with the new structure. Lunchtime brought a small humiliation that felt larger than it should have. Jessica emerged from her office around noon and mentioned she was going to grab lunch with some colleagues from the digital team. She didn't invite me, which wouldn't have been unusual in my previous role since I typically ate at my desk while reviewing campaign data, but now, as her assistant, the exclusion felt pointed, a reminder that I was support staff rather than a peer. I ended up eating a sandwich from the building's lobby cafe, alone at my desk, watching through the glass partition as Jessica's office remained empty. Through the windows, I could see downtown Austin bustling with lunch crowds, people conducting business meetings over meals, networking and building relationships that advanced their career. I felt disconnected from that world, relegated to answering phones and organizing files, while others shaped strategy and made decisions. The afternoon brought what felt like the day's final insight. Around 3 p.m., Jessica returned from lunch with Marcus Webb and 2 other team members, all of them looking energized and collaborative. They gathered in her office for what appeared to be an impromptu strategy session, spreading documents across her conference table and engaging in animated discussion. Through the glass, I could see them reviewing what looked like campaign materials for the Riverside Restaurant Group account, the same project Sarah Mitchell had called about that morning. Marcus was presenting ideas with obvious enthusiasm while Jessica nodded approvingly and made note. The other team members contributed suggestions and refinements, all of them working together on the kind of creative problem solving that had been the best part of my job. I tried to focus on my administrative tasks, but I couldn't stop glancing at the meeting happening just feet away from me. This was my account, my client relationship, my expertise being discussed and developed without my input. Worse, Marcus was clearly struggling with aspects of the project that I could have resolved immediately, having worked with Riverside for 3 years, and understanding their brand challenges intimately. When the meeting ended, and the team dispersed, Jessica called me into her office. She handed me another stack of handwritten notes, and asked me to research competitive analysis data for the restaurant industry. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was asking me to do research for the same project I'd been removed from, but now as support staff rather than the lead strategist. "Rebecca," she said as I gathered the papers, "I want you to know that I really appreciate your institutional knowledge. Your understanding of our clients and their histories is invaluable as we transition to new approach." The compliment felt hollow, a consolation prize that acknowledged my expertise while ensuring I couldn't use it in any meaningful way. It was like being told you're a gifted musician while being handed a job, tuning pianos for the orchestra.
The drive home that evening felt longer than usual, Austin traffic seeming more frustrating, as I replayed the day's series of small humiliations. I'd spent 10 hours performing tasks that any competent administrative assistant could handle, while watching my former responsibilities distributed among colleagues who lacked my experience and client relationships. When I walked through our front door in Cedar Park, Emily was sprawled on the living room floor working on a history project about women's rights movements. The irony of her homework topic wasn't lost on me as I considered my own situation. Ryan was in the kitchen making an after-school snack, and Michael wasn't home yet, presumably still at the office, working on the important projects that kept him busy until 7 or 8 most evenings. Emily looked up from her textbook as I dropped my purse on the counter. "Mom, you look tired. Was work stressful today?" I paused, considering how to answer. Emily was 16, old enough to understand workplace dynamics, but young enough that I didn't want to burden her with adult concerns about job security and financial pressure. "Just adjusting to some changes. Sweetie, new responsibilities take time to get comfortable with." She nodded and returned to her homework. But I caught her glancing at me with the perceptive concern that teenagers sometimes show when they sense their parents are struggling with something beyond their control. Michael arrived home around 7:30, looking unusually upbeat for someone who'd supposedly spent a long day dealing with demanding clients and complex projects. When I asked about his day, he gave vague responses about meetings and strategy sessions, the same non-specific answers that had become his standard response over the past few months. Over dinner, I mentioned Sarah Mitchell's call and her intention to complain to Bob Sterling about my reassignment. Michael's reaction was immediate and sharp, his fork clattering against his plate as he looked at me with something approaching alarm. "Rebecca, you need to be careful about encouraging client complaints," he said, his voice carrying a warning tone I'd rarely heard from him. "Jessica is trying to establish herself in a new role, and having clients question her decisions could really undermine her authority." I stared at my husband, confused by his sudden concern for Jessica's professional reputation. "Michael, I didn't encourage anything." Sarah called asking for me specifically, and when I explained the situation, she decided on her own to speak with Bob. "I can't control how clients react to finding out their account manager has been demoted to secretary." His expression softened slightly, but I could see tension in his jaw that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "I just think it would be better for everyone, including you, if the transition goes smoothly. Making waves could put your new position at risk." The conversation left me feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Michael's protective attitude toward Jessica seemed disproportionate to his concern for my career difficulty. It was as if he had more invested in her success than in my professional well-being, which made no sense given our marriage and family obligation. That night, as I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about the glass partition that now separated me from strategic decisions and meaningful work. The metaphor felt apt for more than just my office situation. I was beginning to feel like there were glass walls between me and the important aspects of my own life, able to see what was happening, but unable to participate or influence outcome. Part 3. Patterns of disrespect emerge. The second week of my new role brought a routine that felt increasingly demeaning with each passing day. Jessica had developed a habit of sending me detailed task lists via email at odd hours, often late in the evening or early in the morning, creating an expectation that I was available to respond to her needs beyond normal business hours. Tuesday morning's email arrived at 5:45 a.m. with 17 separate items ranging from scheduling her dental appointment to researching market data for a potential new client. The casual mixing of personal errands with professional responsibilities felt deliberate, as if she was testing the boundaries of what I would accept without complaint. The most frustrating aspect wasn't the tasks themselves, but the way she presented them. Instead of direct instructions, she framed everything as requests with phrases like, "when you get a chance," and "if you don't mind," maintaining a veneer of politeness that made objecting seem petty. But the underlying expectation was clear. These weren't suggestions, they were commands disguised as favors. By Wednesday, I'd developed a system for managing her demands while trying to preserve some sense of professional dignity. I arrived at the office by 7 a.m., prepared her coffee exactly to her specifications, and worked through her task lists with methodical efficiency. I told myself that demonstrating competence in this role might lead to opportunities to prove my strategic value again. The breakthrough moment came during a department meeting on Thursday afternoon. Bob Sterling had called an all-hands session to discuss quarterly performance and upcoming client presentation. As Jessica's assistant, I was included primarily to take notes and handle logistics, but my presence meant I could observe dynamics I'd previously missed while focusing on my own project. Jessica presented the department's recent achievements with polished confidence, highlighting successful campaigns and client satisfaction metrics. But as she spoke, I noticed something that made my stomach tight. She was taking credit for strategic decisions and client relationship insights that had originated from my work over the past several months. The Riverside Restaurant Group project, which she'd discussed with Marcus and the team earlier that week, was presented as an example of innovative thinking under her leadership. She described the brand positioning strategy and customer engagement approach as if they were new concepts she'd developed, when in reality they were refinements of recommendations I'd made to Sarah Mitchell months before Jessica even joined the company. More troubling was how smoothly she appropriated my work, weaving my insights into her presentation so seamlessly that anyone unfamiliar with the project's history would assume she'd been involved from the beginning. She'd clearly done her homework, studying my client files and campaign documentation to understand the strategic thinking behind successful outcomes. What made the situation even more bitter was watching my former colleagues nod approvingly at ideas they'd heard me present in previous meetings. Marcus looked particularly impressed when Jessica outlined customer segmentation strategies that I'd taught him during our collaboration on smaller projects. The institutional knowledge I'd built over 10 years was being repackaged and presented as fresh leadership insight. After the meeting, several colleagues approached me with comments that revealed how carefully Jessica had managed the narrative around my role change. Patricia from HR mentioned how nice it was that I'd chosen to take on a more supportive role to help with work-life balance. Marcus expressed appreciation for my willingness to step back and let new voices lead strategic initiatives. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Jessica hadn't just demoted me, she'd constructed a story that made my demotion seem voluntary and beneficial. She'd positioned herself as a collaborative leader who valued my experience while suggesting that I'd actively chosen to reduce my responsibility. The manipulation was sophisticated and effective, making me appear grateful for a situation that was actually devastating my career and financial security. That evening, I decided to test a theory that had been forming in my mind about Michael's unusual familiarity with Jessica's perspective and decision. Over dinner, I mentioned some of the strategic approaches she'd presented during the meeting, describing them as new initiatives she was implementing. Michael's response confirmed my growing suspicion. He nodded knowingly and mentioned that Jessica had discussed similar strategies during team discussions, providing details about her thinking that seemed far more comprehensive than what any sales director would typically know about marketing department initiatives. When I pressed him about when these team discussions had occurred, since I wasn't aware of joint sales and marketing strategy sessions involving Jessica, he became vague. He mentioned informal conversations and hallway discussions, suggesting that Jessica was the type of leader who valued cross-departmental input and collaboration. The explanation felt rehearsed, as if he'd prepared answers for questions he expected me to ask. More concerning was his obvious admiration for Jessica's approach to leadership and strategy. He spoke about her methods with an enthusiasm that contrasted sharply with his measured response to my own career challenges. Friday brought what felt like a deliberate test of my willingness to accept increasingly personal tasks disguised as professional responsibility. Jessica asked me to handle her dry cleaning pickup, schedule a vet appointment for her cat, and research vacation rental options for a weekend trip she was planning. None of these tasks had any connection to Sterling marketing business, but they were presented with the same casual expectation as legitimate work assignments. When I hesitated before agreeing to the vacation rental research, Jessica's expression shifted slightly. The friendly mask slipped just enough to reveal something calculating underneath. She reminded me that executive assistants often handled personal logistics for busy executives, and that flexibility and discretion were important qualities in support roles. The message was clear: question her demands, and she could easily frame my resistance as unprofessional behavior that justified further disciplinary action. I was trapped in a role that required me to accept expanding responsibilities while having no authority to establish appropriate boundaries. The weekend provided a brief respite from Jessica's demands, but it also gave me time to reflect on how dramatically my life had changed in just 2 weeks. Saturday morning, while Emily was at soccer practice and Ryan was at baseball training, I found myself sitting in our backyard trying to process the emotional weight of my situation. For 10 years, I'd derived significant satisfaction from my work. I'd enjoyed the intellectual challenge of developing marketing strategies, the relationship-building aspect of client management, and the creative problem-solving that each campaign required. I'd felt valued and respected, confident in my expertise and contribution to the company's success. Now, I spent my days managing someone else's calendar and running errands that had nothing to do with my education, experience, or professional skill. I was invisible in meetings where my insights could have been valuable, reduced to note-taking while others discussed strategies I could have improved based on years of client interaction and market knowledge. The financial impact was becoming more apparent as well. The $20,000 salary reduction meant we'd had to cancel our planned family vacation to Colorado, postpone some home repairs we'd been considering, and recalculate our savings plan for Emily's college expenses. Michael had suggested we could adjust our lifestyle temporarily, but I was beginning to understand that Jessica's treatment of me wasn't temporary at all. Amy called Saturday afternoon to check on how I was adjusting to the new role. When I described the personal errands and expanded responsibilities, her response was immediate and angry. "Rebecca, what she's doing is creating a hostile work environment," Amy said, her voice tight with frustration. "Making you handle her personal tasks isn't part of any legitimate job description. She's deliberately humiliating you and seeing how much you'll tolerate before you quit." Amy's analysis aligned with my own growing realization that Jessica's behavior was strategic rather than coincidental. The casual disrespect, the appropriation of my work, and the expansion of my role into personal servant territory were all designed to make my position untenable while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. "You need to start documenting everything," Amy continued. "Every inappropriate request, every instance where she takes credit for your work, every time she treats you as personal staff rather than a professional employee. If this escalates, you'll need evidence to protect yourself." I knew Amy was right, but the prospect of building a case against Jessica felt exhausting. Legal battles were expensive and time-consuming, and I wasn't certain I had the energy or resources to fight someone who had already demonstrated her ability to manipulate narratives and control perception. Sunday evening brought another late-night email from Jessica with tasks for the upcoming week. This time, the list included researching birthday gift options for her mother, scheduling a consultation with an interior designer for her apartment, and coordinating with a personal trainer about her workout schedule. The professional tasks were buried among personal errands, making it clear that she no longer bothered to maintain even the pretense that I was a business professional rather than a personal assistant. As I read through her demands, I felt something shifting inside me. The resignation and self-doubt that had characterized my first 2 weeks were being replaced by a different emotion: anger. Not the explosive kind that leads to impulsive decisions, but the cold, focused kind that drives strategic thinking and long-term planning. I began to understand that Jessica's treatment of me revealed more about her character and methods than she probably intended. Her willingness to manipulate, humiliate, and exploit suggested that she approached all relationships and situations with the same calculating opportunism. If she was capable of systematically destroying my career, what else might she be capable of? That night, as I lay in bed listening to Michael's peaceful breathing, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. Instead of continuing to accept Jessica's treatment passively, I would start paying attention to everything she did and everyone she interacted with. I would document not just her inappropriate demands, but her methods, her relationships, and her vulnerability. If Jessica wanted to play power games, I would learn the rules and play to win. But unlike her, I wouldn't rely on manipulation and deception. I would use observation, documentation, and strategic thinking to understand exactly what I was dealing with and how to protect myself. The next morning, I arrived at the office with a new sense of purpose. Instead of feeling defeated by my circumstances, I felt like an investigator beginning an important case. Jessica had made the mistake of keeping me close enough to observe her methods and relationships. She'd positioned me to see and hear things that she probably assumed I was too demoralized to notice or too powerless to use. What she didn't realize was that my decade of experience at Sterling Marketing had taught me how to gather information, analyze patterns, and develop strategies based on careful observation. The same skills that had made me successful in client relations and campaign development could be applied to understanding her tactics and protecting my interests. As I prepared Jessica's morning coffee and reviewed her latest task list, I felt a calm determination settling over me. She'd chosen to make me her enemy by destroying my career and humiliating me professionally. Now I would show her what an enemy with patience, intelligence, and nothing left to lose could accomplish. Part 4: The Discovery That Changes Everything. 3 weeks into my role as Jessica's assistant,
I discovered something that transformed my understanding of everything that had happened to me.
It was a Monday morning in late May, and I'd arrived early to prepare for Jessica's first meeting of the day with a potential new client from the tech sector. I was organizing files in her office when her computer chimed with an incoming email notification. The screen was angled toward me, and I couldn't help but notice the sender's name in the preview, Michael Thompson. My husband was emailing Jessica at 7 in the morning, before the workday had officially begun. My hands stilled on the papers I was sorting as I stared at the email preview. The subject line read, "Looking forward to tonight," and the first few words visible in the preview were, "Can't wait to see you again." The casual intimacy of the language made my stomach drop, but I told myself there could be innocent explanations for what appeared to be personal communication between my husband and my boss. I forced myself to continue organizing the files while my mind raced through possibilities. Maybe they were planning a surprise work event. Maybe Michael was helping coordinate something professional that required evening coordination. Maybe the email preview was misleading, and the full context would reveal a business purpose for their communication. But even as I constructed these explanations, a deeper part of my consciousness was connecting pieces that had been scattered across months of subtle observation. Michael's late nights at the office, his unusual familiarity with Jessica's strategic thinking, his protective attitude toward her professional decisions, his calm acceptance of my demotion. Suddenly all of these behaviors formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Jessica arrived at her usual time, sweeping into the office with her typical confidence and barely acknowledging my presence as she settled at her desk. She opened her laptop and began checking emails while I finished arranging materials for her upcoming meeting. I watched her face as she read through her messages, noting a small smile that appeared when she reached what I assumed was Michael's email. The meeting with the tech client went smoothly, with Jessica demonstrating her usual competence in presenting strategic marketing approaches. But I found myself studying her differently now, paying attention to mannerisms and expressions I'd previously dismissed as general professional confidence. There was something in her demeanor that suggested she felt particularly secure in her position, as if she had advantages beyond her professional qualifications. After the client left, Jessica called me into her office to discuss follow-up tasks for the potential account. As she outlined her expectations, I noticed her phone screen light up with a text message, the name displayed briefly before she quickly turned the phone face down. Michael. The casualness of her gesture, the automatic privacy reflex, spoke volumes about the nature of their communication. If their relationship was purely professional, there would be no reason to hide text messages from his wife, especially when his wife happened to be sitting directly across from her desk. "Rebecca, did you hear what I said about the proposal timeline?" Jessica's sharp tone brought my attention back to her instructions. "Yes, you want the initial draft by Wednesday for your review," I replied, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. She studied my face for a moment, as if gauging whether I'd noticed her phone activity. "Good. And remember, I need you to be completely focused during these discussions. Attention to detail is crucial in client development." The warning felt pointed, suggesting that she'd observed my distraction and wanted to ensure I understood the consequences of not maintaining proper concentration during our interaction. The rest of the day passed in a haze of routine administrative tasks, but my mind kept returning to the email preview and text message I'd witnessed. By afternoon, I'd developed a plan for gathering more information about the true nature of Jessica and Michael's relationship. During my lunch break, I drove to a coffee shop several blocks from our office building and called Amy. I needed to discuss my suspicions with someone who could help me think through the implications and potential responses. "Amy, I think Michael is having an affair with Jessica," I said without preamble when she answered. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Amy responded. "Rebecca, that's a serious accusation. What makes you think that?" I described the morning's email preview, the text message, and the months of behavior patterns that suddenly made sense when viewed through the lens of a romantic relationship. Amy listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of understanding or concern. "You know what this means, don't you?" Amy said when I finished explaining my observations. "If they're having an affair,
Then your demotion wasn't about departmental restructuring or bringing in fresh leadership. It was about removing you as an obstacle to their relationship. The implication hit me like a physical blow. My career hadn't been destroyed because I lacked qualifications or because the company needed new strategic direction. It had been destroyed because my presence in a senior role created complications for Jessica's romantic pursuit of my husband. Rebecca, if this is true, then what Jessica did to you could be considered retaliation and discrimination, Amy continued. Using her position to damage your career for personal reasons crosses every line of professional ethics and probably violates employment law. I felt a mixture of vindication and fury building in my chest. For weeks, I'd questioned my own competence and wondered if I'd been naive about my qualifications for advancement. Now I was beginning to understand that my professional destruction had nothing to do with my abilities and everything to do with Jessica's personal agenda. I need proof, I told Amy. Suspicions and observations won't be enough if I'm going to challenge what she's done to me. Be careful, Rebecca. If they're having an affair and they realize you know about it, they might escalate their efforts to force you out of the company entirely. You need to protect yourself while you gather evidence. Amy's warning was sobering, but it also clarified my priority. I couldn't confront Michael or Jessica directly until I had documentation that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I needed to become invisible while gathering the information that would give me leverage to fight back. That evening, I returned home with a new perspective on my family dynamic. Michael was already there, helping Ryan with homework at the kitchen table, looking like the devoted father and husband he'd always appeared to be. But now I found myself analyzing his behavior for signs of deception, studying his expressions and responses for evidence of the double life I suspected he was leading. Over dinner, I decided to test my theory with carefully casual questions about his day and his work relationship. When I mentioned that Jessica had seemed particularly energetic during the morning client meeting, Michael's response was immediate and enthusiastic. He launched into a detailed analysis of Jessica's strategic approach and leadership style, demonstrating knowledge of her methods and thinking that went far beyond what any sales director would typically know about marketing department operations. His admiration for her was obvious and extensive, touching on aspects of her personality and decision-making that suggested intimate familiarity with her character. She really understands how to balance innovation with practical implementation, Michael said, his eyes lighting up as he spoke about her. Some leaders are all vision with no execution ability, but Jessica has this rare combination of strategic thinking and operational excellence. I listened to my husband praise another woman with an enthusiasm he rarely showed when discussing my work, even during the successful years when I was receiving client appreciation and departmental recognition. The contrast was painful and illuminating, revealing how thoroughly his emotional investment had shifted away from our marriage and toward his relationship with Jessica. Emily, who had been quietly eating her dinner while Michael spoke, looked up with the perceptive expression that always reminded me how observant teenagers could be about adult dynamics they didn't fully understand. "Dad, you talk about Jessica a lot lately," she said with the innocent directness that only 16-year-olds could manage. "Is she like your favorite coworker or something?" Michael's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and I watched his face carefully for his response. "She's just doing impressive work in the marketing department," he said, his tone becoming more measured. "It's always exciting when new leadership brings fresh energy to a company." Emily shrugged and returned to her dinner, but I caught her glancing between Michael and me with an expression that suggested she sensed underlying tension even if she couldn't identify its source. After the kids went upstairs to finish homework, I found myself alone with Michael in our living room for the first time since my suspicions had crystallized. He was scrolling through his phone while the television played a basketball game he wasn't really watching. The domestic scene felt surreal given what I now suspected about his activities outside our home. "Michael, can I ask you something?" I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. He looked up from his phone with the slightly guilty expression of someone who'd been caught not paying attention. "Of course, what's on your mind? Do you think Jessica's treatment of me has been fair? The demotion, I mean, and the way she's restructured my responsibilities." His response came quickly, as if he'd anticipated the question and prepared his answer. "Rebecca, I think she's trying to build a team that reflects her vision for the department. Change is always difficult, but sometimes it's necessary for growth. The deflection was smooth and practiced, avoiding any direct criticism of Jessica while implying that my resistance to the changes reflected poorly on my adaptability. It was the kind of response someone might give if they'd discussed the topic extensively with the person being criticized. But don't you think my experience and client relationship should have been valued more in the restructuring? I pressed, genuinely curious about how he would justify Jessica's decisions. Michael set down his phone and looked at me with an expression that mixed patience with mild irritation. Honestly, Rebecca, I think you might be too close to the situation to see it objectively. Jessica inherited a department that needed modernization, and sometimes that means making difficult personnel decisions. Your resistance to change might be part of what she's trying to address. The response was so thoroughly aligned with Jessica's narrative that I felt certain they'd discussed my situation in detail, probably multiple times. Michael wasn't just defending her decisions, he was parroting her talking points about my supposed resistance to change and lack of objectivity about my own performance. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband who was sleeping peacefully after defending his mistress's destruction of my career, I felt a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying. My marriage was over, even if Michael didn't know it yet. My career at Sterling Marketing was probably over too, since Jessica would never allow me to return to a position where I could threaten her control or expose her methods. But I wasn't powerless, and I wasn't without resources. I had information, observation skills, and a growing understanding of their vulnerabilities. Jessica had made the mistake of keeping me close enough to witness her relationships and methods. Michael had made the mistake of assuming I would passively accept his betrayal without fighting back. Over the next few days, I began implementing a careful plan to gather the evidence I needed to protect myself and potentially expose their affair. I started arriving at the office earlier, staying later, and paying closer attention to Jessica's communications and schedule pattern. I noted when she received personal calls, when she left for extended lunches, and when she seemed particularly distracted or energetic. The breakthrough came on Friday afternoon when Jessica asked me to handle a personal task that revealed more than she intended. She needed me to make dinner reservations at an upscale restaurant for Saturday evening, specifying a romantic corner table for two. When I asked for the name for the reservation, she hesitated before saying, "Just use Martina." The hesitation was significant, because Jessica typically used her full name for professional reservations, and had never before asked me to make personal dining arrangements. The secrecy suggested that this dinner was with someone she didn't want publicly associated with her social life. I made the reservation as requested, but I also took note of the restaurant, time, and specific table location.
If my suspicions were correct, Michael would find an excuse to be away from home Saturday evening, and I would have an opportunity to confirm whether he was Jessica's dinner companion. Saturday arrived with unseasonably cool weather for late May in Austin, providing perfect cover for the surveillance I had planned. Michael announced over breakfast that he needed to work late on a presentation for Monday's client meeting, apologizing to the kids for missing movie night, but promising to make it up to them the following weekend. The excuse was perfectly reasonable and entirely believable, except that I now knew to check whether his supposed work obligation coincided with Jessica's dinner reservation. I spent the day maintaining normal family routines while preparing for an evening that would either confirm my worst fears or allow me to dismiss my suspicions as paranoid imagination. At 7:30 that evening, I told Emily and Ryan I was going to visit my mother, who lived on the other side of Austin. Instead, I drove to the restaurant where Jessica had made her reservation, parking across the street with a clear view of the entrance. I didn't have to wait long. At 8:15, Michael's silver sedan pulled into the valet area, and I watched my husband step out wearing the navy blue suit I'd given him for our anniversary 2 years earlier. He handed his keys to the valet with the confidence of someone who belonged at expensive restaurants, then stood waiting near the entrance. 5 minutes later, Jessica arrived in her white BMW, looking stunning in a black dress that was clearly selected for seduction rather than casual dining. When Michael saw her approaching, his face lit up with an expression of genuine joy and anticipation that I hadn't seen him direct toward me in months. They embraced near the restaurant entrance, A lingering hug that lasted longer than any professional greeting, and included a kiss that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Then they walked into the restaurant together, Michael's hand resting possessively on the small of Jessica's back. I sat in my car for another hour, processing what I'd witnessed and making careful notes about times, locations, and behaviors. The evidence was undeniable now. My husband was having an affair with the woman who had destroyed my career, and their relationship explained everything that had happened to me over the past several months. As I drove home through Austin's quiet suburban streets, I felt a strange combination of devastation and relief. The devastating part was obvious. My marriage was over, my trust had been shattered, and my life was about to change in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. The weekend following my discovery of Michael and Jessica's affair was the longest of my life. I moved through our family routines like an actress playing a role, making breakfast, doing laundry, and attending Ryan's baseball game while my mind raced with plans and possibilities. The hardest part was maintaining normal conversations with Michael, who seemed relaxed and content, probably because his evening with Jessica had gone exactly as planned. Sunday morning brought an unexpected opportunity when Michael announced he was going to play golf with colleagues from the sales department. The invitation had supposedly come up spontaneously, but I suspected it was another cover story for spending time with Jessica. After he left, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. I drove to our local electronics store and purchased a small digital voice recorder, the kind that attorneys and journalists use for interviews. I also bought a notebook specifically for documenting times, dates, and observations. If I was going to build a case against Jessica and Michael, I needed to approach it with the same methodical planning I'd once used for major marketing campaigns. Back home, I created a timeline of everything that had happened since Jessica joined Sterling Marketing 6 months earlier. I wrote down every strange conversation with Michael, every unusual late night at the office, every instance where he'd defended Jessica's decisions with more enthusiasm than the situation warranted. The pattern was clear once I laid it out chronologically. The affair had likely begun within weeks of Jessica's arrival at the company. Her promotion to vice president hadn't been based solely on her qualifications. It had been orchestrated by someone with inside knowledge of the company's decision-making process and internal politics. Michael, as a sales director who'd been with Sterling for 8 years, would have had access to information about David's retirement timeline and insights into what qualities Bob Sterling valued in leadership candidates. More troubling was the realization that my demotion had been planned well in advance. Jessica's restructuring of the marketing department wasn't a response to operational needs. It was a preemptive strike designed to neutralize me as a potential threat to their relationship. By removing me from strategic responsibilities and isolating me in an administrative role, she'd minimized my visibility within the company and reduced my ability to observe her methods or challenge her decision. Monday morning arrived with a new email from Jessica that demonstrated how comfortable she'd become with pushing boundaries. Her task list included researching weekend getaway options for 2 people, specifically requesting information about romantic bed and breakfast establishments within driving distance of Austin. She wanted detailed descriptions of amenities, pricing, and availability for the following weekend. As I researched romantic retreats for my husband's Mistress, I felt a cold determination settling into my chest. Jessica's brazenness revealed her confidence that I was completely powerless to challenge her behavior. She was so certain of her control over the situation that she was willing to have me plan romantic weekends that would likely include my own husband. The voice recorder, hidden in my purse, captured my phone conversation with the Hill Country Bed and Breakfast as I gathered information about their couple's packages and special amenities. If Jessica thought she could use me as her personal travel agent for affairs with my husband, she was about to learn that every humiliation she inflicted was being documented. Tuesday brought what felt like Jessica's most audacious move yet. She asked me to schedule a lunch meeting with Michael, ostensibly to discuss coordination between the sales and marketing departments on upcoming client presentations. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at a restaurant downtown, away from the office environment where their interaction might be observed by other colleagues. When I handed Jessica the confirmation details for her lunch with Michael, I watched her face carefully for any sign that she realized the irony of having me arrange her date with my own husband. Her expression remained perfectly professional, as if asking an employee to coordinate meetings with their spouse was completely normal business practice. That afternoon, I made an appointment with Amanda Chen, a divorce attorney Amy had recommended. I didn't want to file for divorce immediately, but I needed to understand my legal options and rights. The consultation was scheduled for Friday afternoon, ostensibly during a doctor's appointment that would give me legitimate cover for being away from the office. Wednesday evening brought an interesting development when Emily approached me with concerns about changes she'd noticed in our family dynamic. We were alone in the kitchen after dinner, Michael having disappeared to his home office to work on what he claimed was an urgent project presentation. "Mom, is everything okay between you and Dad?" Emily asked, her voice carrying the careful tone teenagers use when addressing potentially volatile adult topics. I paused in loading the dishwasher, considering how much I could safely share with my 16-year-old daughter. "What makes you ask, sweetheart?" Emily glanced toward the stairs, making sure Michael wasn't within hearing range before continuing. "He's been acting different lately. Like, distracted and secretive. And you seem stressed about work more than usual. I know you got that new job with your boss, but you don't seem happy about it." Her perceptiveness caught me off guard. I'd thought I was successfully hiding my emotional turmoil from the kids, but Emily had clearly been observing changes in both her parents' behavior. The realization that our family's dysfunction was becoming visible to our children added another layer of urgency to my need for resolution. "Work has been challenging lately," I admitted carefully. "Sometimes when companies go through changes, it affects everyone's stress level." "Dad and I are both dealing with new pressures at the office," Emily nodded, but her expression suggested she sensed there was more to the situation than routine workplace stress. "If you ever need to talk about anything, I'm here, okay? I know I'm still in high school, but I'm not a little kid anymore." The conversation left me feeling both grateful for my daughter's maturity and guilty about the chaos that was about to disrupt her stable world. Emily and Ryan had grown up in a household where their parents' marriage seemed solid, and their family life was predictable. Soon, they would learn that everything they'd assumed about their parents' relationship had been built on deception. Thursday's lunch meeting between Jessica and Michael provided the perfect opportunity to test my surveillance skills. I arranged to take my lunch break at the same time as their scheduled appointment, ostensibly to run personal errands downtown. Instead, I positioned myself at a coffee shop across the street from their restaurant, where I could observe their interaction through the large windows. They arrived separately, maintaining the pretense of a professional meeting, but their body language told a different story. Michael arrived first and chose a corner table that provided privacy from other diners. When Jessica joined him, they embraced briefly before sitting down, and throughout their meal they leaned toward each other with the intimacy of lovers rather than colleagues. I used my phone to take discreet photos of their interaction, capturing images that clearly showed their romantic involvement. The photos weren't perfect quality, but they were sufficient to document that their relationship extended far beyond professional collaboration. More importantly, I could see Jessica's hand resting on Michael's arm across the table, a gesture of possession that spoke volumes about how she viewed their relationship. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, much longer than any legitimate business discussion would require. When they finally prepared to leave, Michael paid the check while Jessica gathered her purse and jacket. They walked out together, and Michael's hand found the small of her back as they approached the valet station. The same possessive gesture I'd witnessed during their Saturday dinner. As I watched my husband and his mistress part ways with a kiss that lasted several seconds longer than appropriate for business associates, I felt the final pieces of my marriage crumble. But alongside the personal devastation, I felt a growing sense of strategic clarity. Jessica and Michael had become careless in their confidence, providing me with documentation that would be invaluable when the time came to expose their affair. Friday afternoon's meeting with Amanda Chen proved more enlightening than I'd expected. Amanda was a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in complex divorce cases involving workplace relationships and financial misconduct. When I explained my situation, her expression grew increasingly serious. Rebecca, what you're describing isn't just an affair, Amanda said, leaning back in her leather chair. If Jessica used her position to retaliate against you because of her relationship with your husband, that's a clear case of workplace discrimination and abuse of power. The fact that she's continuing to humiliate you professionally while conducting the affair adds additional legal complications. Amanda explained that Texas employment law provided protections against retaliation and discrimination, even in at-will employment situations. If I could prove that Jessica's treatment of me was motivated by personal rather than professional reasons, I might have grounds for a lawsuit against both her and Sterling Marketing. The challenge will be proving the connection between her personal relationship with your husband and her professional decisions regarding your career, Amanda continued. Employment courts are familiar with retaliation cases, but they need clear evidence that personal motivations influenced workplace actions. I showed Amanda the photos from Thursday's lunch meeting and played portions of the audio I'd recorded during Jessica's more inappropriate task assignment. Amanda studied the evidence carefully, occasionally asking questions about timing and context. This is a good start, but you'll need more comprehensive documentation to build a strong case, she advised. Employment law requires proving a pattern of discriminatory behavior, not just isolated incidents. You need evidence that shows her treatment of you differs from her treatment of other employees in similar situations. Amanda also explained the potential financial implications of both a divorce and an employment lawsuit. Texas was a community property state, which meant that assets acquired during marriage would typically be split equally between spouses. However, if Michael had used marital resources to support his affair, or if his relationship with Jessica had resulted in financial benefits for him at my expense, those factors could influence the settlement. Document everything, Amanda emphasized as our meeting concluded. Financial records, communication patterns, workplace interactions, changes in your husband's behavior or spending. The more evidence you have, the stronger your position will be when you're ready to take action. That weekend I implemented Amanda's advice with the systematic approach I'd once used for complex marketing campaigns. I created detailed spreadsheets tracking Jessica's assignments, noting which tasks were professional versus personal and documenting any instances where she treated me differently from other employees. I also began paying closer attention to Michael's financial behavior. I reviewed our credit card statements for unusual charges and noted any cash withdrawals that couldn't be accounted for through normal household expenses. While I didn't find evidence of lavish spending on Jessica, I did discover several restaurant charges and hotel bookings that didn't correspond to any family activities or legitimate business travel. The most damaging discovery came when I accessed Michael's email account using a password he'd shared years earlier for coordinating family schedules. The account contained months of personal correspondence with Jessica, starting from just 3 weeks after she'd joined Sterling Marketing. The early emails were flirtatious but maintained plausible professional cover, discussing strategy sessions and department coordination with underlying sexual tension. But as their relationship progressed, the communication became explicitly romantic and sexual, leaving no doubt about the nature of their involvement. More troubling were emails where they discussed my situation directly. In one message from early April, Michael had written, "Jessica, I think Rebecca is starting to suspect something. We need to be more careful about public interactions until her role transition is complete." Jessica's response was chilling in its calculating coldness. "Don't worry about Rebecca. Once the restructuring is finished, she'll be too focused on keeping her job to pay attention to anything else. Besides, having her handle my administrative tasks actually provides perfect cover for our communication." The emails revealed that my demotion had been explicitly planned as a cover for their affair, designed to keep me busy with menial tasks while reducing my status within the company. They'd used my professional destruction as a smokescreen for their personal relationship, treating my career as a disposable obstacle to their romantic convenience. The most recent emails discussed their upcoming weekend getaway to the Hill Country bed and breakfast I'd researched for Jess. Michael had written about looking forward to having uninterrupted time together, away from the complications of managing their secret at work and home. Reading my husband's romantic correspondence with another woman was devastating on a personal level, but it was also professionally liberating.
I finally had undeniable proof of their affair and its connection to my workplace treatment. The emails provided the evidence Amanda had said I needed to build a strong legal case against both Jessica and Mike. Sunday evening, as I prepared for another week of playing Jessica's assistant while gathering intelligence about her methods and relationships, I felt a transformation that went beyond anger or determination. I felt strategic clarity combined with moral certainty. Jessica and Michael had chosen to destroy my career and humiliate me professionally as cover for their personal betrayal. They'd assumed I was too powerless and too demoralized to fight back effectively. They were about to learn that they'd made a serious miscalculation. My decade of experience in marketing had taught me how to research, plan, and execute complex strategies designed to achieve specific outcomes. The same skills that had made me successful in client relations and campaign development were now focused on exposing their affair and protecting my interests. The difference was that this time, I wasn't trying to sell a product or build a brand. I was fighting for my reputation, my financial security, and my children's future. Jessica and Michael had given me powerful motivation and documented evidence of their misconduct. Now they were going to discover what happened when someone with nothing left to lose decided to fight back with intelligence, patience, and thorough preparation. As I fell asleep that Sunday night, I felt more confident than I had in months. Monday would bring another week of Jessica's condescending tasks and Michael's casual deceptions, but I was no longer their victim. I was their investigator, building a case that would soon allow me to reclaim control over my life and career. The next phase of my plan would require careful timing and flawless execution, but I was ready for the challenge. Jessica thought she'd neutralized me by turning me into her personal assistant. Instead, she'd given me front-row access to observe her vulnerabilities and document her mistakes. Soon she would discover that keeping your enemies close sometimes meant giving them exactly the tools they needed to destroy you. The moment I'd been preparing for arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June, when Jessica made a mistake that gave me the perfect opportunity to execute my plan. She'd scheduled what she called an urgent all-hands marketing meeting for that afternoon, supposedly to discuss quarterly performance and upcoming strategic initiatives. What she didn't realize was that I'd been monitoring her email communications and knew the real purpose of the meeting was to announce my termination. The previous Friday, I'd discovered an email thread between Jessica and Patricia from HR discussing my performance issues and the need to transition my responsibilities to more suitable personnel. The language was carefully crafted to create a paper trail justifying my dismissal, painting me as someone who'd been unable to adapt to new organizational structures and strategic directions. But Jessica had made a critical error in her eagerness to eliminate me. She'd scheduled the meeting for the same afternoon that Bob Sterling was hosting a client presentation for Hartwell Industries, our biggest account worth over $2 million annually. Bob would be in the building along with several board members and key stakeholders who rarely attended routine departmental meetings. I spent Monday evening finalizing my presentation, a comprehensive document that outlined Jessica's misconduct, her affair with Michael, and the connection between her personal relationships and her professional decisions. I'd organized months of evidence into a clear narrative that showed how she'd abused her position to retaliate against me while using company resources to facilitate her romantic relationship with my husband. The presentation included printouts of the email exchanges between Jessica and Michael, photographs from their restaurant meetings, documentation of inappropriate personal tasks she'd assigned me, and a detailed timeline showing how my demotion coincided with the escalation of their affair. I'd also prepared financial records showing how Michael had used our joint credit cards for expenses related to his relationship with Jessica. Tuesday morning arrived with unseasonably cool weather, as if the universe was providing perfect conditions for the confrontation I'd been planning for weeks. I dressed carefully in my best professional suit, the navy blue ensemble I'd worn to important client presentations during my successful years as senior marketing manager. If I was going to reclaim my professional reputation, I wanted to look like someone who belonged in strategic discussions, rather than someone relegated to administrative support. Jessica arrived at the office that morning with an energy that suggested she was looking forward to the afternoon's events. She'd probably spent weeks anticipating my termination, imagining how much easier her life would become once I was no longer present to observe her methods and relationship. She had no idea that I'd been using my position as her assistant to gather comprehensive evidence of her misconduct. The morning passed with routine administrative tasks, but I could sense Jessica's anticipation building as the afternoon meeting approached. She made several phone calls with her office door closed, presumably coordinating with HR and other department heads about the personnel changes she planned to announce. She also spent considerable time reviewing documents that I assumed were related to my performance evaluation and termination paperwork. Around 11 a.m., I received an unexpected opportunity when Patricia from HR stopped by Jessica's office to discuss logistics for the afternoon meeting. Their conversation, conducted just outside my desk area, revealed details about Jessica's plans that confirmed my suspicions about the meeting's true purpose. "We'll need to handle this carefully," Patricia said in a low voice that she probably thought I couldn't hear. "Terminating someone who's been with the company for 10 years requires proper documentation, especially if there are any questions about the restructuring decisions." Jessica's response was telling in its casual confidence. "Rebecca's performance issues have been well documented since the department reorganization. Her inability to adapt to new strategic directions and her resistance to collaborative approaches have made her position untenable." The conversation continued with discussions about severance packages, final paperwork and transition planning for my remaining responsibility. Listening to them discuss my professional execution with such clinical detachment was infuriating, but it also provided final confirmation that I'd correctly interpreted Jessica's intentions. Lunchtime provided an opportunity to implement the final phase of my plan. Instead of eating at my desk as usual, I walked to Bob Sterling's office on the executive floor and requested a brief meeting with his assistant, Margaret, who'd been with the company for 15 years and commanded significant respect throughout the organization. "Margaret, I need to speak with Bob about some serious concerns regarding departmental management and potential policy violations," I said, keeping my voice professional but urgent. "Would it be possible to schedule a few minutes before this afternoon's marketing meeting?" Margaret studied my expression with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd spent years managing executive communications and filtering legitimate concerns from routine complaints. "Rebecca, you look like you're dealing with something significant. What kind of policy violations are we talking about?" I explained briefly that I had documentation of behavior that violated company ethics policies and potentially exposed Sterling Marketing to legal liability. I emphasized that the situation required immediate attention from senior leadership before any personnel decisions were made in the afternoon meeting.
Margaret checked Bob's calendar and found a 15-minute window at 2:30, just 30 minutes before Jessica's scheduled meeting. "I'll make sure he's aware this is urgent," she said, her expression serious. "Bring whatever documentation you have, and be prepared to present your concerns clearly and concisely." The afternoon arrived with a tension that felt like the calm before a thunderstorm. I spent the early hours completing Jessica's routine tasks while mentally rehearsing my presentation to Bob Sterling. I'd practiced the key points dozens of times, ensuring I could deliver the essential information within the 15-minute time frame while remaining professional and factual. At 2:15, I gathered my evidence folder and walked to the executive floor, my heart beating rapidly, but my mind focused on the opportunity I'd been preparing for weeks. Margaret escorted me into Bob's office, a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Austin and walls lined with awards and recognition from industry organizations. Bob Sterling was a man in his early 60s who'd built Sterling Marketing from a small local agency into a regional powerhouse over the course of 25 years. He had a reputation for being direct, ethical, and protective of both his company's reputation and his employees' welfare. If anyone would take my concerns seriously and investigate thoroughly, it would be Bob. "Rebecca, Margaret tells me you have some serious concerns about departmental management," Bob said, gesturing for me to sit in the chair across from his desk. "What's going on?" I opened my evidence folder and began with the most damaging information, placing printouts of Michael and Jessica's email correspondence on his desk. "Bob, I have documented evidence that Jessica Martinez is having an affair with my husband, Michael Thompson, and that she's used her position to retaliate against me professionally because of their personal relationship. Bob's expression shifted from polite attention to sharp focus as he began reading the emails. I watched his face carefully as he processed the romantic communication between Jessica and Michael, noting the moment when his eyes narrowed with what appeared to be anger and concern. These emails indicate that they've been planning to use my role change as cover for their relationship. I continued, placing the timeline and task documentation on his desk. Jessica has been assigning me personal errands unrelated to company business, and she's systematically excluded me from strategic responsibilities while taking credit for work I completed before her arrival. Bob studied the evidence methodically, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, contexts, and my documentation methods. When he reached the emails discussing their weekend getaway plans, his jaw tightened visibly. "Rebecca, this is extremely serious," he said, looking up from the documents. "If these allegations are accurate, we're dealing with multiple policy violations, potential legal liability, and a breach of professional ethics that could damage our company's reputation." I placed the final piece of evidence on his desk, photographs from Jessica and Michael's restaurant meetings, showing clear romantic involvement between a supervisor and a subordinate's spouse. I believe Jessica planned to terminate me in this afternoon's meeting, as a way to eliminate the primary witness to their affair and remove any potential complications to their relationship. Bob's response was immediate and decisive. "That meeting is postponed indefinitely. I want you to leave this evidence with me, and I want you to go home for the rest of the day. Don't discuss this situation with anyone, including Jessica or Michael, until I've had time to review everything thoroughly and consult with our legal team." As I prepared to leave his office, Bob made a statement that gave me hope for the first time in months. "Rebecca, if what you've documented is accurate, then significant changes are going to be made to correct this situation. No employee should have to endure professional retaliation because of someone else's personal misconduct." I returned to my desk to gather my personal belongings, noting that Jessica was in her office preparing for the meeting she expected to use for my termination. I collected my purse and laptop bag, leaving behind the administrative supplies and task list that had defined my humiliating weeks as her assistant. As I walked toward the elevator, I felt a liberation that went beyond the relief of finally exposing Jessica's misconduct. For the first time since her arrival at Sterling Marketing, I felt like a professional again rather than a victim of someone else's power games. The drive home through Austin's afternoon traffic gave me time to process what I'd set in motion. By confronting Bob Sterling with documented evidence of Jessica's affair and retaliation, I'd forced the company to choose between protecting an executive who'd violated multiple policies and supporting an employee who'd been wrongfully damaged by personal misconduct. That evening, I made the difficult decision to tell Emily and Ryan that significant changes were coming to our family. I couldn't provide all the details yet, but I wanted them to understand that their parents' marriage was ending and that we would need to adjust to new living arrangements in the coming weeks. Emily's response revealed the maturity I'd observed in her recent behavior. "Mom, I kind of suspected something was wrong between you and Dad. You've both been acting different lately, and there's been this weird tension in the house." Ryan, being younger, had more questions about practical concerns like whether he'd have to change schools or leave his baseball team. I assured both kids that my primary focus was maintaining stability in their lives while working through the adult complications that had created this situation. Michael arrived home around 7 p.m., probably expecting to find me devastated and defeated after what he assumed had been my termination meeting. Instead, he found me calm and purposeful, having spent the afternoon consulting with Amanda Chen about divorce proceedings and employment law options. "How did your meeting go today?" Michael asked, his tone carefully neutral but his eyes searching my face for signs of distress. "Very well, actually," I replied, watching his expression shift from expectation to confusion. "I had some important information to share with company leadership, and I think they'll find it quite illuminating." Michael's face paled slightly, as if he was beginning to suspect that his secret might not be as secure as he'd assumed. "What kind of information?" I smiled with the confidence of someone who held all the advantages in a conversation. "Professional concerns that needed to be addressed at the executive level. I'm sure you'll hear about it soon enough." The next morning brought a phone call from Margaret, requesting my presence at a meeting with Bob Sterling, the company's legal counsel, and Patricia from it. When I arrived at Sterling Marketing, I could sense tension throughout the building, as if word had spread that something significant was happening in the executive offices. The meeting lasted 2 hours and covered every aspect of the evidence I'd presented the previous day. The legal counsel, a sharp woman named Diana Rodriguez, asked detailed questions about my documentation methods, the timeline of events, and my interpretation of Jessica's motivations for the retaliation. Thompson, based on our preliminary review of your evidence, we believe you have a strong case for workplace discrimination and harassment, Diana said. The company takes these allegations very seriously, and we're prepared to take immediate corrective action. Bob Sterling outlined the company's response, which exceeded my most optimistic expectations. Jessica Martinez was being terminated immediately for policy violations, abuse of authority, and creating a hostile work environment. Her access to company systems had been revoked, and she was being escorted from the building that morning. Additionally, Bob continued, we're offering you reinstatement to your previous position as senior marketing manager, with full restoration of your salary and responsibility. We're also prepared to discuss compensation for the professional and personal damages you've experienced as a result of Miss Martinez's misconduct. The vindication was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by the sobering realization that my marriage was definitively over. Michael's involvement in the affair meant that our relationship couldn't be repaired, regardless of how the professional situation was resolved. That afternoon, I returned to my original office, overlooking Lady Bird Lake, finding my awards and client appreciation letters exactly where I'd left them before Jessica's restructuring. Marcus Webb, who'd been temporarily assigned to the space, helped me move my belongings back with obvious relief that the department's leadership chaos was being resolved. Rebecca, I'm so glad you're back, Marcus said as we arranged my desk setup. The past few weeks have been really confusing, and a lot of us were worried about the direction things were heading under Jessica's management. The revelation that other employees had also been concerned about Jessica's methods provided additional validation for my decision to fight back against her treatment. I hadn't been paranoid or oversensitive. I'd been the target of deliberate professional sabotage that had affected the entire department's morale and effectiveness. Over the following weeks, the full extent of Jessica's misconduct became apparent through the company's internal investigation. She had been manipulating client assignments to benefit Michael's sales targets, providing him with insider information about marketing strategies and budget allocations that gave him unfair advantages over other sales directors. The investigation also revealed that Jessica had been planning to restructure the entire marketing department in ways that would have eliminated several long-term employees while promoting recent hires who were more aligned with her approach. My demotion had been just the beginning of a larger plan to remake the department according to her personal preferences and strategic alliance. Michael's termination came 2 weeks after Jessica's, when the investigation uncovered evidence that he'd used his position to facilitate their affair and had violated company policies regarding interdepartmental relationships and conflicts of interest. The revelation that both my husband and his mistress had lost their jobs as a result of their misconduct provided a satisfaction that helped offset the personal pain of our marriage's collapse. The divorce proceedings moved forward with surprising efficiency, partly because Michael's documented betrayal and financial misconduct made it difficult for him to contest my request for asset division and custody arrangement. Amanda Chen proved to be an excellent advocate, ensuring that I received fair compensation for the marital assets, while protecting Emily and Ryan's financial security through appropriate child support arrangements. 6 months after Jessica's arrival at Sterling Marketing had disrupted my life, I found myself in a position that was stronger than where I'd started. My reinstatement came with a salary increase and expanded responsibilities that reflected the company's commitment to retaining experienced talent. I'd also received a settlement from Sterling Marketing that compensated me for the emotional distress and professional damages caused by Jessica's retaliation. More importantly, I'd discovered personal strength and strategic capabilities that I hadn't fully appreciated before being forced to fight for my professional survival. The experience of building a case against Jessica and Michael had revealed skills in investigation, planning, and execution that enhanced my confidence in both personal and professional contact. The kids adjusted to our new family structure better than I'd expected, partly because the toxic atmosphere created by Michael's deception had been replaced by honest communication and stable routine. Emily seemed particularly relieved that the underlying tension she'd sensed in our household had been resolved, even though the resolution meant her parents' divorce. Jessica Martinez disappeared from Austin entirely after her termination, reportedly taking a position with a marketing firm in another state where her misconduct at Sterling Marketing wouldn't be common knowledge. Michael remained in Austin but moved to a smaller apartment and took a sales position with a company that paid significantly less than his Sterling Marketing salary. The most satisfying aspect of my victory wasn't the professional vindication or financial settlement, but the knowledge that I'd refused to accept injustice passively. When Jessica and Michael had conspired to destroy my career as cover for their affair, they'd assumed I would quietly submit to their manipulation rather than fight back effectively. They'd learned that appearances can be deceiving, and that someone who seems powerless might actually possess resources and determination that aren't immediately visible. My decade of experience in marketing hadn't just taught me how to build brands and manage client relationships, it had also taught me how to research, plan, and execute strategies designed to achieve specific outcomes. A year later, I received an unexpected validation when Sarah Mitchell from Riverside Restaurant Group called to congratulate me on a marketing award I'd won for a campaign that had grown her business by 40%. During our conversation, she mentioned how relieved she'd been when I'd returned to my strategic role after the brief period of administrative confusion in the marketing department. "Rebecca, I have to tell you, when that woman tried to reassign our account to someone else, I was ready to find a new marketing firm entirely," Sarah said. "Your expertise and understanding of our brand is irreplaceable. I'm so glad Sterling Marketing recognized that and made things right." The conversation reminded me that my professional reputation had been built on genuine competence and client relationships that couldn't be easily dismissed or transferred. Jessica had temporarily disrupted my career trajectory, but she hadn't been able to destroy the foundation of expertise and trust that I'd spent years developing. As I concluded another successful day in my restored office, looking out at the Austin skyline and preparing for a client presentation that would utilize all my strategic marketing skills, I reflected on how much my life had changed since Jessica Martinez had walked into Sterling Marketing with her designer suits and calculating ambition. She'd taught me that workplace politics could be vicious and personal, but she'd also inadvertently taught me that I possessed strength and strategic thinking abilities that I'd never fully tested before being forced to fight for my professional survival. Most importantly, she'd taught me that justice sometimes requires patience, careful planning, and the courage to challenge people who abuse their power. The woman who'd thought she could destroy my career to facilitate her affair with my husband had ultimately given me the opportunity to prove that I was far more formidable than she'd realized. And while I wouldn't recommend the experience to anyone, I had to acknowledge that fighting back against Jessica's manipulation had revealed capabilities that would serve me well throughout the rest of my career and personal life. Standing in my office that evening, reviewing successful campaign results and planning strategic initiatives that would benefit both my clients and my company, I felt a satisfaction that went beyond professional achievement. I'd learned that when someone tries to destroy your life for their own convenience, the best response isn't anger or despair, but careful planning and decisive action designed to ensure that justice ultimately prevails. Jessica Martinez had wanted to eliminate me as an obstacle to her ambition. Instead, she'd created an adversary who was far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. And in the end, that miscalculation had cost her everything while giving me back my life, my career, and my confidence in my ability to overcome any challenge that might arise in the future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.